Welcome back to the Hybrid Athlete channel. I am Dr. Paul Rimmer, and today I'm going to talk to you about my first ever 100-mile training week. Now, I know most people watch these videos for a minute or two, they get bored and switch off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a summary, and then I'll get into the nitty gritty about how I went about it, building up to it, so on and so forth. So here are my 5 take-homes from my first 100-mile training week. Take-home number 1. Do you need to have a 100-mile training week to run ultramarathons, even up to and including distances of 100 miles? In my opinion, no, you don't. A 100-mile training week is something that I accidentally kind of did, and I will talk about. However, this brings me up to point number 2, which is, did I find a 100-mile training week useful? The answer to that was yes, or not primarily in the ways that you may or may not think. Number 3 is that my 100-mile training week did not actually leave me feeling completely broken. So a 100-mile training week doesn't have to be something which is almost kind of this crescendo thing that you're aiming at. A 100-mile training week can be something that I think even for someone who's a bigger athlete can be included quite frequently. And actually, since this video, but since the conception of this video in this first 100-mile training week, I've actually done another one, kind of by accident, but I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. Point number 4 is, if you're going to do a 100-mile training week, don't just do it arbitrarily thinking it's a target to aim at. Build up to it slowly, and also be aware that it's a lot of time on your feet. So please don't just think, right, well, ultra athletes do 100-mile training weeks, I've got to do 100-mile training weeks. It doesn't work that way. You've got to make sure that your life fits around it. And that brings me on to point number 5, which is that if you're going to attempt to run high training volumes in preparation for an event, that these things are likely to be beneficial if you are an ultra athlete that is seriously concerned with pushing their fitness to the limits. However, you have to factor into a consideration that when you're comparing yourself to professional ultra athletes, and even somebody like me whose life is built around fitness, that it's not necessarily about your capacity to run 100-mile weeks which matters. It is the capacity to juggle life around that 100-mile weeks. It's not necessarily a physical thing. It's not even necessarily a mental thing. For a lot of people, it is just, juggling work, life, all of that stuff, and having the time to do a 100-mile training week, particularly if you're as slow as I am, which is going to be the key determinant of whether you can do that or not, and should be at the heart of any programming that you do. Okay, so that's kind of like my 5 take-homes, 5 things that I've learned from it. Let's talk about building up to that 100-mile training week. So to put me as an athlete into context, I have been running now distances of ultramarathon distances and above for a couple of years, obviously built to that quite slowly over a period of time. So I've got this base level of fitness now. I know my pacings, I know what my body's capable of. I'm pretty good and in tune with my hydration and my nutrition. So this isn't, a 100-mile training week is probably something where you can build towards over a several month period. But as long as you have the right kind of programming, the right kind of consistency, and the right kind of experience to make sure that a 100-mile training week isn't an event, it's a training week, right? So I know a lot of people who have worked up to like having this really big goal of running a 100-mile training week, and they almost see it as like kind of an event. And it's sort of like, well, no, it should be part of your training. It should still be recoverable from. You shouldn't be broken for weeks afterwards by doing this. And I certainly wasn't. With that being said, and putting myself in the context of someone who's got a lot of experience getting things right and some experience of getting things wrong, if you've seen any of my other content, you may know why that is. I'm not going to get into that here. But basically, off the back of base building, understanding my body, understanding my hydration, understanding my physical limitations over a period of 2 years, the real build up to this 100, at the back end of last July, so I'll put some of my data in here so you can see it. You'll notice that after last July, my running volume decreased considerably. That's because I had a bit of a hip injury, needed to recover and rehab from that. Actually hurt my hip running my last 100-mile attempt, and then still did a bit more running over the summer, but I took a bit of time off. But that base level fitness was still there. I was still doing lots of work on a treadmill, a lot of rehab work, things like that, strengthening. So I was able to, when I returned to running, in a very structured manner, increase my running volume quite quickly. Because I was still doing some running, it just wasn't on my Garmin, as you can probably tell from the data here. But it was very low mileage, rehab type stuff. Anyway, we move on. I basically decided this year, for reasons which are outside the scope of this video, I wanted to front load a lot of my training volume initially. So obviously after coming back of like not having too big a high volume months through the summer, from September, October, November, December time, I was increasing my running volume, you know, the classic sort of around 10 to 20% in terms of mileage per week. But again, probably on the lower end of that spectrum is something I would recommend to most people. But because I had that kind of conditioning and volumes already in me and experience, I knew I could do that quite safely. Just on that note, I think that part of the problem of increasing running volumes sort of arbitrarily based on percentages is that's only one piece of the puzzle. It doesn't really tell you about the intensity of those efforts as well. And that's something that becomes really important when you're considering these 100-mile training weeks. As I built towards that, the intensity of those sessions of that mileage reduced significantly as the volume got bigger. So we have this sort of volume intensity trade-off. If you're trying to maintain the same intensity doing a 50-mile week as you are doing a 100-mile week, chances are if you're not experienced at doing that, you're really going to struggle, and that 100-mile week is going to leave you feeling broken. So we have this sort of drop off in intensity as volume has increased, and that was massively important. Anyway, so as you can see from my data leading into Christmas here, I was running quite frequently, higher volume, trying to front load my volume, but I had a bout of just like little illnesses and viruses and things leading up to Christmas, which really disrupted my running. You will also notice that on some of my data I put here, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of running mileage. The reason was, and the reason my Garmin data is lower, isn't because I'm lying to you in some way. It's simply because in the winter months, I tend to do a lot of my training on a treadmill, and there's various reasons for that. So what I was really doing was once every couple of weeks was going out and doing a big long run outside on a specific course, or, you know, hitting some trails or whatever. But most of my other training was done indoors because indoor running tends to be a little bit more cushioned, and when I'm trying to build up running volumes, being a heavier athlete, I find that I can get a bit more running volume done on treadmills. Again, we still want to have some adaptation in tissue, so we don't want to do too much of that. It's part of the reason, but not a primary reason. Point number two, which is why I did a lot of my training indoors, is because I guarantee you, as soon as it starts to become hot weather, everybody in the UK struggles. Training indoors allows you to regulate temperature better, train in a warmer environment, help those sweat glands hypertrophy. And reason number three is really quite simply, it's partly to do with that maintenance of conditions. Like the treadmill doesn't lie necessarily. And when you're front loading a lot of volume, I was doing a lot of interval work. I was doing a lot of my intense work around that time period of building up those initial volumes quite quickly. A lot of that was higher intensity work, like longer intervals, shorter intervals, trying to get some sprint intervals back in. I had a bit of a hamstring tear, so trying to get some confidence back sprinting. A lot of that volume on a treadmill, like the treadmill doesn't lie, so it's easier to monitor your kind of progressions. You're not dealing with wind, rain, ice, sleet, snow, you know, typical beautiful, you know, UK weather. So for me, treadmills are an invaluable tool in terms of monitoring my progress and not being able to kind of like lie myself through sessions or being at too many sort of extraneous variables where you then end up suffering with your performance because you're not sure if you're making progress or whatever. So for me, because of the nature of how I program, and again, I've discussed this in other videos, the way that I tend to program for myself is it's quite a progressive approach to sort of intervals and things as well. You can do this outdoors, you can do it with a heart rate monitor, you can run off RPE. I've talked about all the benefits of all of those things. But for me personally, being able to like increase interval durations, increase interval speed, reduce rest periods, all of that stuff is much more controllable on a treadmill. And for me, in the way that I program for myself, that just works really well. It's the thing that I've found the most benefit. So that's why I did a lot of my work on the treadmill, which doesn't then reflect on my Garmin data because I don't tend to wear my Garmin in the gym because I'll tend to lift and then do my interval sessions afterwards, and I hate having a watch on my wrist when I'm doing intervals. Anyway, so that's why a lot of the running data that you will see moving forwards in this video isn't actually there. So I'll try and articulate that as best I can. So I front load a lot of my volume, and then I was really using one run every couple of weeks or one long run every couple of weeks of say 30 plus K to then kind of almost like, if you imagine undulating my training. So I'd have like a higher intensity interval type week, then a bit of a rest period, a little mini taper, then a big long run, then go back into a high intensity interval week. And that included then incorporating some much slower runs. So one of the key things to running a 100-mile training week for me was learning to run slower. In fact, a lot of run walks. So obviously we're talking about ultramarathons here. We're talking about the fact that most ultramarathons will involve some form of walking because of hills, etc., etc., etc. So one of the advantages that I talked about in the kind of my initial points and what was really beneficial to me was learning to run slow to handle higher volumes. Didn't necessarily carry that over into performance for my first big long actual race of the year, which I'll talk about in another video, which was the Race to the King. It was an interesting day at the office. Didn't go to plan, but again, different video for a different time. But I was very aware that the whole point of building up to this training mileage, it kind of wasn't really intentional. It just kind of happened that for the events that I've got coming up now, so I'm now 5 days out from the Thames Path Ultra. So it's 184 miles over 4 days. So basically 4 ultra marathons on consecutive days. I was aware that I had to get good at running higher volumes on consecutive days. So it wasn't like I was going out with this idea of, right, I'm going to target a 100 miler, but it was definitely something where it was on the cards. Had a 50 miler in March. Again, took that quite easy. Had a bit of a disaster on that day with stomach issues, but still finished in a reasonable time. But I was still fine. Like when I finished it, I was fine the next day. I sort of pushed a little bit in that, but almost treated it like a training run. So again, I have no issue with people doing in events or even with clients doing events, but there's events that you race and there's events that you use as training runs, and they're not the same thing. And I think a lot of people struggle with that, which is why when they then think about, oh my God, 100-mile training week, maybe doing a 50 or 60K run within that, they freak out because it's like, I can't do that. So yeah, because you don't train like you race. So that was a big mental barrier to get over, and something that's helped massively, particularly in terms of then doing consecutive days and letting my body adapt to that consecutive days running, like back to back to back long runs. So that was kind of my necessity for the 100-mile training week. It wasn't like that was a target. It was just, if I'm going to run 184 miles over the course of 4 consecutive days, I better get some mileage in there in the ballpark of that. And again, a lot of that is logistical stuff, physiological adaptations to like long runs. And, people will say, 2 to 3 hours is enough, and that's fine. But again, it's getting used to running on tired legs, getting used to the body condition to those kind of volumes. The more volume you can handle, it allows you to then, one, figure out what intensity you can operate at to handle that amount of volume. And also, base levels of fitness, right? So I also had this idea of building a lot of my volume up earlier in the year by kind of May, June time, so that going into race season, it was just a case of race, recover, maintain fitness. That's just the way I operated. Anyway, built my volume up over that period of time. Nice and steady, nice increases, plenty of chance to recovery. One big long run every 2 to 3 weeks, nice recovery, and then back to back in that with some much slower runs. With a family member of mine who's trying to get into their running. So that was great because it was a nice natural limiter. So I could do a big long run of 30, 40, 50K, come off the back of that and go for a nice easy run, like run walk with a novice runner, a very beginner runner. So that worked really well. How did I do the 100-mile training week? Well, first and foremost, I looked for an opportunity to get some support. So what I actually did was I volunteered at the GB Ultra's Chester 100-mile race. And I did the first 50 miles on the first day as a sweeper on the course. And on the second day, I did the last 20 odd to 22, 23 miles, give or take. I actually ended up over distancing on those. So I put some of the Garmin data here. Now, because I was sweeping at the back of the course, I was also collecting course markers. And there was also time when I had to stop if there was athletes in trouble. Okay, make sure they were okay. Waiting at various checkpoints for cutoffs, things like that. Seeing if people were continuing. So it actually slowed my race pace down, which meant that I felt fine. So on the first day, I think I was out for 15 hours or so, 16 hours before I got to the 50-mile cutoff. But my watch doesn't reflect, not cutoff, 50-mile mark, 80 odd kilometers. My watch is way under because of the stop-start. So my Garmin's got auto pause. So if you don't believe me, you can go and check out the GB Ultras thing. You can see the GPS trails. You can see all that stuff. It was about 84, 85K that I did on that day, but it's registered, 70 odd here? A bit bizarre. So I slept on the village hall floor, which was glorious, as you can imagine. And then the next morning, I then picked up and then swept the course. Now, again, that was super slow. There was a lot of people suffering at that point. So it was basically, I had to wait for the final cutoff to see if people were making it in. I got to run for a few kilometers to catch people up who'd left maybe an hour or two before the people who didn't make the cutoff got in there, or people who had dropped out. So I got in quite a bit of running initially, but then when I started to catch people, obviously my job was to stay at the back. So it basically came down to a very slow walk at points. I racked up in the best part of 70 odd miles. And so came off the back of that with no blisters, no issues, hadn't pushed myself, was plenty of time to feed, plenty of time to recover. So again, this is what I was talking about before. Volume increases, then your intensity's got to decrease. And it was a kind of nice force reduction of intensity. So that was on the Saturday into the Sunday. Actually, after that session, because the finish line is about literally 30 meters from the gym where I train, with the treadmills where I run. It starts in Ellesmere Port and at the leisure centre there, EPSV, Ellesmere Port Sports Village, and that's my gym. So I took my bag, my drop bag that was there, went into the gym, and then I did another hour or so on the treadmill, got my kilometerage up then to, I'm trying to think the conversions now. So I was on 70 odd miles, easily 70 odd miles. I think I pushed up to 75, 76 miles there. And then it was quite simple from that point there. Took a rest day on the Monday. Tuesday went off into the countryside, to Snowdonia, did a leg clap there, nice and slow. That was another 8 to 10k, I think, in the end. And then just had a couple of other sessions that week of sort of 10 to 15 kilometers. And the cool thing was that last run that I had was like kind of like a tempo-ish run, and I wanted to finish with an effort that really challenged myself. So I kind of did all the hard stuff very easy, so that at the end of the week I wanted to know how much sort of my performance had maintained across the week. I hope that makes sense. Even though I'd done all that running mileage, my biggest ever volume training week, I actually was still maintaining performance at the end of that week, which just goes to show you that kind of trade-off. So that's the mentality and the attitude that I had. Since then, though, I mentioned this at the start, I've actually had another accidental, almost 100-mile training week. And that was actually more of a time in feet week. It was actually time on my feet week, which still all counts. I've put the data here. It was like a ridiculous amount of steps. So I'd actually run earlier on in the week. I was actually starting to, it was my last actual big training week before I started to taper for this event a few weeks ago. And basically what happened was I was running in and out. I'd done some consultancy work, some work with business down in Cardiff. So I was staying down there. So I was actually running in and out of work. There was an issue with a delivery that was being sent out. So it meant that I was on my feet a lot, helping out with that. So I was lumping and dumping boxes. I was on my feet for like basically 10, 12 hours a day. So if you look at my step count there, it's ridiculous. So although it wasn't a training week, really, it wasn't my intention. I ended up like walking and running over 150 kilometers that week. And that felt harder than the 100-mile training week, because of just the accumulation of 5 or 6 days of that amount of time on my feet. But not just time on my feet, moving about, time on my feet, like lifting boxes, moving things around, moving pallets, lifting things up to stack boxes. It was all hands on deck getting this delivery out. My shoulders were ruined, my neck was ruined, my back was ruined, muscle groups were getting utilized in ways that they hadn't. So actually, although my kind of structured training for that week, and I was meant to do a big long run on the weekend, my final long run of maybe 20 to 25k, I didn't do that because I was just so broken and I was working. But I did come off the back of that feeling kind of like I had a harder training week in some senses, very different, very, mentally demanding, lack of sleep. So all of that stuff kind of played into my hands accidentally. So I'm just trying to take the positives from losing structure. That normally have caused me to panic, but actually it was pretty hard. And then that was a couple of weeks ago. So then since then, I've done a couple of runs, a little bit of climbing, a couple of lifting sessions, and that's been it really. So that's how I went about it. Again, there's 1,000,001 ways that you can structure a 100-mile training week if you chose to do one, which I don't think there's necessarily a need to do that. I think that people are capable of running 100-milers on much lower training volumes than that. And I know this because I have clients that do it. The benefits really were, like I said before, it was pacing. It was knowing that if I do pace myself and I do have that capacity to kind of learn to run slower and not brutalize myself, that I can go indefinitely now over several days, which has given me a massive amount of confidence moving forwards. And so that's the advantage that I took from it. Okay, it taught me a lot about handling different conditions, a lot about the paces at which that I can take on more food and how my digestive system doesn't shut down, and really trying to refine the psychological element of just being out for that length of time and doing that much mileage and coming out of that and feeling okay. It's just been a massive boost psychologically, if anything. Right, guys, hopefully that was useful to you. Stay tuned for my next video, which is going to be a race review on the Race to the King, which I'm going to hopefully do before I do my next ultramarathon, which is going to be the video where I log the whole or best part of the Thames 184 mile. I'm going to do a little vlog on that one. You will notice though, in the Race to the King video that's coming up, very little video content. There's a reason for that, and it isn't technological. It's because I was not having a good time. But race review coming. Take it easy, guys. Look after yourselves, you wonderful humans, and I will speak to you all soon. Peace.